Well, welcome everyone to this next session of our conference on inequality today. My name's Tom Cochrane. I'm on the board of the TJRyan Foundation and I'm also from QUT. It's my pleasure to introduce two speakers and what I'll do is say something about them before they start. The first is Dr. Jim Stanford, who's the Director of the Centre for Future Work based at the Australia Institute. Jim served for over 20 years as economist and director of policy with Uniform, Canada's largest private sector trade union, formerly the Canadian Auto Workers. He is also the Harold Innes Industry Professor in Economics at McMaster University in Canada. Jim has recently been a prominent public commentator on inequality and the future of work in Australia. Professor John Quiggin is an Australian Laureate Fellow in Economics at the University of Queensland. He's prominent as a research economist and as a commentator on Australian economic policy. Professor Quiggin is a Fellow of the Econometric Society as well as the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. He's produced over 1,500 publications, including 6 books and more than 200 refereed journal articles in fields including decision theory, environmental economics, production economics, and the theory of economic growth. His book, Zombie Economics, How Dead Ideas Still Walk Among Us, was released in 2010 by Princeton University Press and has been translated into 8 languages. He is a founding board member and research associate of the TJRyan Foundation. The format for this next session will be that Jim will talk to us for about 25 minutes, John will respond for about 10, and then we'll have time for Q&A as before. So without further ado, would you please welcome Jim Stanford.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tom. Good morning, everyone. Lucky you, on this session, you don't just get one economist, you get 2 economists. And keep in mind, an economist is someone who's good with numbers and didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So hopefully you had coffee at the break there. Tom, thank you and the other organizers for inviting me. It's a long way to Brizzy from my native Canada, as your former Prime Minister called it. And I did note, as I was planning the trip, I checked the weather in Brisbane today, and I saw that it was going to be warmer here today in the middle of your so-called winter than it is at home in Toronto in the middle of our so-called summer. So that's interesting, and a good cause for a glass of wine on that balcony at the end of the day. So for those that don't know, maybe we could call up the PowerPoint here, if that's all right. Thank you. Who don't know about the Centre for Future Work, it's a new initiative under the umbrella of the Australia Institute, and our goal is to become a kind of a centre of excellence on work, employment, fairness, equality, industrial relations, the future of work and jobs, and so on. And it's a brilliant name. I have to give full credit for the name of our centre to Ben Oquist, who's the director of the Australia Institute. I was going to call it the Centre to Ruthlessly Expose the Iniquities of Capitalism. But he thought Centre for Future Work had more appeal, broader appeal, and he's right. And you wouldn't believe how many calls we get just of people who Googled Future of Work, Centre for Future Work. I'll call them. So that worked out well. Anyways, there's our website. We've published about 20 different reports and briefing notes and so on in our first year, all free access at the website. And there's my Twitter handle and the Centre's Twitter handle. I invite you to join the discussion there. So I'd like to talk about, obviously, the trends in inequality in Australia, and obviously a newcomer to the country, so I don't want to sound too critical, but the reality is, and you all know this, that's why you're here, we're in an awful mess in Australia in terms of the trends in income distribution and what it means for the cohesiveness of our society, but also the effectiveness of our economy. Australia was known as the country where it was a fair go for all, and at one point that was true. Australia was one of the most egalitarian countries in the industrialized world, comparable to Sweden in the 1970s, which is an amazing achievement, and it's been pretty well all downhill since then. Today, Australia has worse than average income inequality. So I like the slogan, a fair go for all, and I know that it has cultural resonance here, and I know that it motivates people to fight for something that's decent. But as a description of reality, it no longer applies and should be banned on grounds of truth in advertising, okay? Australia is not the land of a fair go for all. Australia has worse than average inequality compared to other industrialized countries, and it's getting worse fast. And again, I come from Canada, where we prize the existence of that thin line called the 49th parallel enormously, okay? And we are always congratulating ourselves and getting repetitive strain injury, patting ourselves on the back, saying, oh God, we're better than the Americans anyways. And I've heard that slogan here 142,000 times. At least we're better than the Americans. Guess what? That is not much of a benchmark, okay? And by all kinds of measures, including wealth concentration at the top, tax collections as a share of GDP, program expenditure as a share of GDP, trade union membership as a share of employment, you're frankly not much better than the Americans. The gap between Australia and America is closing fast. And I don't say that to criticize, I say that to call to action. And let's face this challenge and the consequences that are being felt everywhere. The economic costs of inequality, this isn't just about sort of a touchy-feely, caring, sharing kind of argument. This is a hard-headed argument about economic well-being and the future of our economy as well as a society. And there's been all kinds of interesting and powerful research in the last decade from all over the world, from all disciplines, not just economists, about the costs of inequality. And I know that especially these days where someone in Liberal Party strategy room decided this was the moment to rekindle the Cold War, apparently, with all this stuff about the politics of envy and going back to East Berlin, apparently, and other things like that, that if you raise a concern about inequality, you're just envious, right? And I always think of that with the video. Have you ever seen the video of the two monkeys in side-by-side cages, and one gets a banana and the other doesn't, right? And the one that didn't get the banana goes bananas, I guess you could say. And it's actually interesting because it shows that there's a biological process happening. And the more that we understand about the history of the human race and social biology and social anthropology, we actually understand we are hardwired to respect equality. And it isn't just, that I'm envious that monkey went bananas when the one got a banana and the other didn't. It's because since the time humans descended from the trees in East Africa somewhere, our social intelligence and innate capacity to cooperate are in fact what helped us survive as a species and spread over the world, for better or worse for the planet, okay? It was our ability to perform complex tasks together and negotiate and allow that to happen in a fair and sustainable way that actually is crucial to us surviving as a species. And that goes completely against the homo economicus bullshit, if I can use that technical term, that people are taught from year one, right, John? Year one in economics, that we're all motivated by individual greed and nothing else. And that's, social anthropologists laugh at that because it's completely inaccurate as a description of where humans came from. So it isn't about envy, it's actually about recognizing that cooperation and some kind of sharing of both the work and the gains of work is essential if this project known as humanity is to continue. So it's not just a personal hardship of people who don't have enough material incomes and goods that's the problem. It's not just the stress and insecurity that their families experience, and we see that big time in Australia today with household debt higher today as a share of incomes and GDP than it was in America in 2007. And if you go back to America in 2007, you know that wasn't a good position to be in. There's all kinds of evidence, concrete evidence, again, from multiple disciplines about the health, the education, the well-being, criminality, other outcomes. For example, the new science about the study of stress hormones in the blood and the long-term effects on everything from diabetes to heart disease and so on. Stress hormones that are released by being in a situation of chronic inferiority compared to the rest of those around you. And the evidence is very clear on this, that this is harmful for your health. Inequality is harmful for your health, not just because you might be poor. You could actually have a decent, sustainable living standard, but still experience that if you're looking down the street and seeing someone else who's better than you, just like the monkey in the cage next to the one who got the banana. The fiscal costs that come from those damages are enormous as well. Less tax revenue paid because the masses of people aren't getting more incomes, but also the costs of all of the social consequences of inequality, from prisons to hospitals. And now, of course, new evidence about the impact of inequality on macroeconomic performance. In a short-run sense, the fact that the masses of people in Australia are not getting real incomes gains despite their work and their productivity slows down economic growth, because we have a position of chronic inadequacy in purchasing power, and the more income is redistributed to the rich, they try to spend it, believe me, okay, but they don't succeed in spending it all, okay? So the reality is it's a constant drain, both the income going to high-income households and the income that's hoarded by corporations who are taking in more after-tax cash flow than they know what to do with, so they're not reinvesting. So those are a constant drain on purchasing power, but there's a longer-run problem when the link between work and income is broken, as it has been. With productivity growing and real incomes not growing, there's going to be damage done to the mechanics and the incentives that drive the whole economic system. I want to talk about inequality in the context of work, because I work at the Center for Future Work, so anything to do with work, Google it and you'll come to my center, okay? Inequality is not just about some people having more money than other people, okay? That's kind of a trivial way to look at it. There's structural schisms in society that help to explain what's happening, and those do relate, in my judgment, to how labor markets are working and not working, and I'm going to try and put it in that context. And others have recognized the importance and problems of wages. I know that, say, our treasurer, Scott Morrison, sometimes he's like Mr. Hyde. Wage increases are bad and terrible, and if anyone got a wage increase who's a member of the working class, it will be on the front page of the Australian, showing how terrible that the world is about to end, okay? Except when the budget is being defined, in which case he becomes Dr. Jekyll, and wage increases are good. In fact, here are the wage forecasts based in the last budget, and in order to balance his budget by 2021, at the end of it there, he has to expect total wage payments to be growing by 5.25% a year. So go for it, CFMEU, okay? Then, of course, as if that wasn't upside down enough, we've got a central banker who's urging workers to get to the barricades and demand higher wages, because he's recognizing the damage of wage stagnation. Again, not just for social cohesion and inequality. I don't think it's got quite to the Reserve Bank yet on that score, but at least for economic performance. I mean, honestly, talk about pigs flying. The central banker is usually the one who marches in and takes the punch bowl away, right? This time he's gone there, he's putting extra tequila in the punch, and the party's just getting going. So a way to think about this is in a way to think about inequality in two dimensions. Most commonly, we think about inequality as the gaps in incomes across different households, and there's all kinds of studies about different ways to measure it, their income, their wealth, their consumption possibilities. Different statistical tools to measure it. You know, for the graduate students in the room, you've gone bug-eyed thinking about Gini coefficients and ratios and top income shares. And this is important. It's important to understand how income distribution has shifted between different households. This is one of my favorite measures of it. This is from the great database that was associated with Emmanuel Saez in Berkeley and Thomas Piketty in France, and great people in Australia gathering the Australian data. So this is the share of the top 1% of households in the total personal income of Australia, and there's a giant U-shaped curve there. Now, only Scott Morrison could look at that graph and say inequality isn't rising, okay? Which apparently is his view of it. And I think he must have compared that point to that point, okay? That's the only way you could look at that graph and decide that inequality isn't rising. Of course, in a historic sense, inequality is rising and continues to rise dramatically, although you will have little differences from one year to the next. And in fact, I think of this as one of two incredibly clarifying ways to describe the history of what Sally McManus was talking about just a while ago, the history of neoliberalism. Look at what happened here in World War II. The top income share fell dramatically because suddenly everybody else in the country got put back to work. It bumped back up again for a couple of years right after the war, but then it declined steadily in the face of industrial development, the development of a welfare state, and the institutions of redistribution, and everything that went with it. And so from the perspective of the top 1% of society, this was a disaster. Okay, you had their share of total national income go from, say, 11% before the war to a low of about 4.5% in the late 70s. Now imagine that, the 1% getting only 4.5%, only 4.5 times their fair share of the total income. That's completely unacceptable, obviously. So we had, and this picture was drawn in other countries around the world, we had a deliberate project to turn things around. And that's what Sally called neoliberalism. And it was the whole set of fiscal, monetary, labor market, globalization, regulatory, and social policies that was designed to turn that ship around. And, you know, just because they met in a room with the Mont Pelerin Society at some chateau doesn't mean it was a conspiracy, okay? And I've always known that just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not following you, okay? So keep that in mind. And of course, they did turn things around. So starting with Volcker shock in America, the election of Thatcher and Reagan, and all of the spillover from that around the world and in Australia. And it took on a unique character in Australia, didn't it? Because some of those policies were implemented by Labor governments, not all of them, and they were certainly made worse by coalition governments. But it was part of an overall vision of trickle-down economics, enrich the power and freedom of those at the top, and expect the activity unleashed as a result to benefit and lift all boats. That is the logic, and that's still what is claimed. And I think this is actually a telling picture of the reasons for neoliberalism, and certainly the timing of neoliberalism and the end results of neoliberalism, which is rebuilding that share of the plutocracy, if you like, the top 1%, back to near the levels that it would have had before World War II. That's one dimension of inequality. Another way that economists would measure inequality is not across households, but across factors of production. That is to say, the different resources that are used in the economy, and correlate possibly the two between the different groups of households. Because the thing about rich people is not just that they have more money. Okay, they do have more money, but they play a different role in society and in the economy by virtue of the nature of the resources that they control, and in particular, the difference between labor and capital and the roles that they play in the economy, and the shifting balance of power between them is a key part of the story behind the first dimension of inequality, which is how income is distributed across households. So this is another graph. This is, if I would argue, the second graph that shows with incredible clarity both the reasons for neoliberalism, the timing of it, and the consequences of it. This measures the share of labor compensation, including wages, salaries, superannuation contributions, and other forms of benefits, as a share of total GDP in Australia. And again, you had in the 50s, this graph only started in 58. This is when the ABS quarterly data began, but you could extend the graph back a little bit further and the trend would still be there. The 50s, 60s, and 70s, you saw a rising share of labor in the total economic pie that was produced, reflecting the growing economic, social, fiscal, and cultural power of workers to demand a fair go. And by the 70s, they had as fair a go as has ever been seen on this planet in Australia. But, you know, again, despite those policies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I'm starting to sound like an oldies goldies disc jockey, aren't I? The greatest economic policies of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's been all crap since. Except for the music. The music, of course, was best in the 80s, because that's when I went to college. And everybody's favorite music is when they went to college. Okay. Well, anyway, starting in the late 70s, same time as the previous graph turned around, this one turned around too and has been declining more or less steadily ever since. With the labor share of GDP, there's a cyclical component because when the economy has a recession, and I know that doesn't happen too often here, but when it does, profits fall faster than wages, so the labor share can rise during times of economic weakness. But that's a bit misleading. You have to kind of look at the long-run trend, and it's down. And in fact, this year hit the lowest share since this data was being collected. So I think this picture of the changing factor distribution of income is related to the previous picture of the changing household distribution of income. for the main reason that less money going to labor means more money going somewhere else. And the 11 percentage point decline in labor's share of the GDP that you can see here from the late 70s until now, 11 percentage points, 10 of those 11 percentage points are reflected in an increase in the share of corporate gross surplus, is how it's measured in the national income accounts. Gross surplus of corporations has risen by 10 percentage points of GDP. So it's a straight up redistribution of the pie from labor to capital. And the reason this is reflected in the changing household distribution of income is because wealthy people are wealthy. I went to university for 10 years and got a PhD so that I could come out with statements like that. Wealthy people are wealthy. So the business wealth that is built into their portfolios and their holdings and their ownership and their capital holdings are the ones benefiting from that 10 percentage point increase in the share of capital in GDP. We can go into a little bit more detail if we like about understanding the reasons for the decline. Arithmetically, it's because labor productivity is growing, but labor compensation is not growing, or certainly not growing as quickly. So, labor productivity continues to chug along. It isn't nirvana. We don't have the age of the robots appearing according to labor productivity growth. It's actually been kind of sluggish, if anything, but it's continuing. Real wage growth, on the other hand, has slowed down. Right now it's zero, but even in the medium term, it's been much, much slower, about 1/3 as fast as productivity is growing. So if you're producing more but not being paid more, arithmetically, you're going to have a lower share of the total pie. So labor productivity has been continuing, and this is, again, an immediate refutation for those who say Australia just can't afford to do the things we used to do, back in the 70s. The reality is each hour of labor expended in Australia produces 60% more real value added than it did even in the mid-80s, let alone the mid-70s. So anything we could afford in the mid-70s, we can afford close to times two today, but the compensation is not keeping pace with that, which means a handy little thing that economists call the unit labor cost, which is the share of the total cost of an output, a unit of output, that is destined for the pockets of the workers who produced it, not just in the immediate factory, but in other things down the road, is shrinking. And that has also hit a record low. So when business says Australia is too expensive, workers are too expensive, this is why we have to cut wages and cut entitlements, cut penalty rates. In fact, in recorded history, there's never been a time when workers, relative to their productivity, have been cheaper in Australia today. I don't know what I just did there. Okay, sorry, wrong button. So in terms of the relationship between factor income and household income, this is where we have to talk about the distribution of wealth in society. It's hard to get data on the distribution of wealth for various reasons. First of all, it's so concentrated in a small group of households. It's unlikely, Gina Reinhardt is going to be called when the ABS does their randomized survey of households. And even if by fluke she was called, her minion who answered the phone would probably not come fully transparent on the amount of wealth that was owned there. So the survey methodology misses top incomes. You can also go to administrative data like income tax data that's more reliable. On the other hand, even that's tricky because there's this place called Panama where some of that wealth ends up. Very important when thinking about wealth data to distinguish between financial assets and other assets, in particular, the value of your own home that you happen to live in, okay? I know that by that standard, most Australians are millionaires, okay? But I hate to pop your bubble. The reality is you still need a house over the head, and just because you live in a property boom doesn't make you all millionaires. If you step back from that and actually look at disposable or liquid business wealth that I think is more relevant economically, the concentration is startling, and it's not well known. And if it was well known, I think people would be angrier about it. The top 1% that was getting that share that I talked about probably owns about at least a third of total financial and business wealth. There are 39 billionaires. If you read the rich list that BRW puts out once a year, 39 billionaires in Australia that have 6% of the total financial wealth, 39 people. So that's half the people in this room. So that's the aisle there. You guys are the billionaires, okay? And you own more wealth than the bottom half of society. More wealth than 12.5 million Australians, which is saying something. And if you decompose the growth in top incomes that I showed you in the first U-shaped graph, the overwhelming increase in wealth is the result of capital incomes. The overwhelming increase in incomes to the wealthy is because of incomes on capital, not because, they got a raise in their job. So I think that helps to tell the story of why we need to address the structural maldistribution of power in our society. What we're seeing today is the result of a multidimensional, deliberate effort that began in the 70s and has been implemented incrementally ever since to enhance the power and freedom and privilege, again, at every step of the way. So the tax system, for example, clearly is biased in favor of income from capital as opposed to income from labor. So you've got partial taxation of capital gains, partial taxation of dividends, negative gearing loopholes, and other advantages that only go to people who own wealth rather than people who work for a living. So the reality is if you flip properties or flip bonds all day, you only pay tax on half of your income. If you flip burgers at McDonald's, okay, you have to count every dollar of income that you made. And this is a systematic effort to use one set of policies, and the same thing happens in other areas of policy to benefit those who have wealth and have benefited from it. Our response to inequality has to recognize those structural factors going on in society and think not just about redistributing income between households, which is an important part of it. So we do have to make the tax system fairer by closing some of those loopholes. We also have to be systematic in redistributing economic power among the different factors in society, because that will give us a better shot at a decent pre-tax distribution of income. And that's what the tax system can then go to work on. And this is where I'm entirely in line with the points that Sally was making earlier about the need to strengthen the institutions of wage determination and income redistribution in our economy. Before the tax man ever shows up, we have to give working households as households and labor as a factor of production a better shot at wresting a share of the pie that they've lost over the last 30 years. And that involves strengthening state-managed labor regulations like the minimum wage and the modern award system, but it also means empowering workers independently through their unions to have a shot at winning wage increases that match or exceed their productivity gains, and thus win back some of the power and some of the wealth that has been shifted the other way. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for inviting me to talk here. Am I okay?
Would you like to
No, if this one's working, I'm fine with it.
So then I might do not.
Sure.
Since we're going to be having
Jim talked quite a bit about productivity, and I want to tie the links a bit more between productivity and the trickle-down theory, of which we've heard quite a bit, and in which my zombie economics books has a chapter devoting to this particular zombie. And a crucial part of that trickle-down theory is the notion that market incomes reflect productivity, that people work because they want money. The more productive their incomes depend on how productive they are. So if you let them keep more of the income they generate, they'll be more productive and the whole society will go very well. Well, Jim's pointed out this isn't working out very well for workers, hasn't been for some time. There isn't, in aggregate, workers certainly aren't seeing the benefits of the work they get, of their additional productivity in terms of wages. But I'd like to look at the other side of the coin, capital, and make the point that the relationship between capital incomes and productivity has never been weaker than it is at present, or not in the recent past, and that reflects a bunch of things that are going on. The first is that corporate profits are increasingly dependent upon monopoly power of various kinds. Industries globally are more concentrated. A large share of corporate profits are generated by the likes of Macquarie Bank, owning regulated monopoly assets and essentially in the business of gaming regulation with governments. Closely related phenomenon is a very large share of profits going to the financial sector rather than to the actual producers of goods and services. And the final point, which Peter hinted at, is the return of inherited wealth as a major source of wealth and income, which means that people with very mediocre abilities and very limited capacity to contribute to society and nonetheless raking in huge incomes. And of course, the President of the United States is an ideal example of this. Somebody who, while you can't tell his wealth, appears to have barely maintained the value of the wealth he inherited from his father, but nonetheless, of course, is incredibly wealthy and has benefited in maintaining his wealth at that level, has benefited from all manner of tax arrangements. So that's, I think, from the point, and I think that recognition reflects, I think, the collapse of faith in the United States, which has happened quite suddenly, I would say, in the space, certainly inside the last 10 years, the collapse of faith in the US in what was called the American dream, the idea that if you worked hard, went to college, studied hard, you could rise from the bottom of the American income distribution to the top. That belief in the US has collapsed. It's reflected, apparently, where we heard Peter talking about the middle class. In US focus groups, they've stopped using the term middle class because everybody regards this as a cheat, that they thought they could be middle class, but now they're either struggling to, if they're in the middle class, they're struggling to avoid them and their kids falling out or struggling to climb out of it. That kind of general acceptance has collapsed quite suddenly. So that's, I think, the background, and that's seen, I think, as the facts of inequality become more evident both in statistical studies like those of Piketty, but also, of course, in lived experience, we are seeing a change. And so now I'd like to come briefly to the defence of ScoMo and Matthias Cormann and say, while it's absurd to suggest that the Labor Party's policies, as they've announced them, are going to take us to Cuba or East Germany, it's perfectly fair of them to say that they're the most left-wing policies put forward by a Labor opposition in several generations. If you take a generation as 15 years, there has at no time in those 3 generations been a Labor government campaigning on increasing taxes. Indeed, we go back to almost the first act of the Hawke government was the so-called trilogy, which promised that taxes and expenditure as a share of GDP would never henceforth increase. So we really have to go back to certainly to the Whitlam government to find any opposition, any Labor opposition or government which has taken a more left-wing position relative to the, of course, easy to do when the state of politics has moved so far to the right, but this is a fair description. And it's striking, and I don't think it's only because Bill Shorten looks so inoffensive on TV. They've done this without any real pushback. The attempts of the Australian and the Cormanns and ScoMos to paint this as some kind of disaster have fallen absolutely flat. Labor's announced policies which have been seen by the so-called hardheads as electoral suicide and remained, the polls don't move much upwards, but they also just roll along with a 3 or 4% lead when Labor says we're going to tax trusts, we're going to reinstate the top income earners levy, and so forth. So I think there is in that a sign for the is in that a very hopeful sign for the way in which politics are going. And certainly, if for your pains you read the Australian when they aren't going on about single-sex marriage or, whatever, when they aren't going on about their various cultural war obsessions, they're writing long lamentations that they have indeed lost the debate over economic policy. And that's, I think, does suggest that there's room to act. I think, as Jim said and as Sally McManus said, that win has already taken place to a significant extent on issues of income redistribution. The idea that we should be redistributing income, that we should be making companies pay more tax rather than less, that high income earners should pay more, has been surprisingly successful. The big issue is the issue of the unfair distribution of market income, essentially generated, as Sally and Jim both said, through the decades of labour market reforms, all of which have reformed labour markets in the interests of employers and against the interests of workers. And I think that's an issue which the politics of need to be addressed carefully. There's no doubt that decades of anti-union propaganda have been effective. On the other hand, what we see, I think, even looking at the local coverage of the bus drivers dispute is is suddenly a shift in the direction of not complaints about evil bus drivers stopping people getting home from work, but certainly something which, by the standards of the capitalist media, is far more even-handed than anything we've seen in the recent past. I think the fiasco of the various royal commissions the current government undertook, $100 million spent to essentially zero effect in terms of discovering and prosecuting any criminal behaviour is striking, especially when, as Sally points out, nothing is being spent to stop regular, widely reported and large-scale theft by employers from workers. In the time that commission was running, literally thousands of workers were ripped off by their employers, and these were widely reported. What they found, that somebody got a tattoo on the union credit card, is the level of criminality that those tens of millions of dollars managed to elicit in terms of prosecutions. So I think the time is right for a shift. We certainly are facing dire threats here, and we have to remember, as was previously been pointed out, the pull of an alternative explanation, a racist and tribalist explanation being promoted by Trump, by Pauline Hanson, and by large elements of the current government. I think, though, the appeal of the standard neoliberal model has almost completely collapsed, and I think that's the question now is what will replace it. Thank you.
Yes. All right, we've come now to questions and answers, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. So without further ado, who'd like to ask the first question? Right, gentleman here.
Question to Jim. What shape would the graphs take if you had the data and were able to do it? The graphs of the changes in transfer payments in that same period, long time pre-70s through till now. Do you know what shape those graphs would look like?
Hi, by the way. Hi, Laurie.
G'day, how are you?
Good. I didn't give income distribution for all levels. The U-shaped one for the top 1% would include transfer payments, include after tax, after transfer. Transfer payments have grown as a share of GDP and as a share of total income since the 70s and haven't really decreased even under the sort of more strict conservative governments. Although they have for targeted groups. The one group that's been especially targeted for cuts in transfer payments would be working age people, because they're trying to enhance the compulsion to accept whatever you get in the labor market rather than having an alternative out. Transfer payments have been really important in moderating the growth of inequality. They haven't stopped the growth of inequality, but they've been very important, as have the consumption of public services. This is something to keep in mind. The role of government in collecting taxes, hopefully in a progressive way, and it is still a progressive system, a flawed one, but still progressive, distributing some of the money in transfer payments, and then using the rest to pay for public services that are consumed by everyone, by my reckoning, reduces inequality several-fold. So I think it's been very important. I don't know, John, if you have anything to add on that.
No, I think that covers most of what I would have said. So.
Right, a question here, then.
Yeah. You briefly touched on the idea that the neoliberal project was actually a multidimensional systematic effort and across a number of dimensions. And I'd like to, if you could expand on that, because I think to some extent the question about how you unpack it may go to how it was packaged up.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in a way, there's also a difference between how it was packaged, as in designed, and how it was sold, in terms of what it was justified as being. Initially, it was justified as a solution to stagflation, right? We were going to get inflation under control with tight monetary policy, independent central banks, inflation targeting, and so on. In fact, the goal was to get workers under control, not inflation, because inflation is under control, and guess what? Things have gotten worse, not better. So I think it was, to some extent deliberate in the sense of recognizing that all the things that happened in the 60s and 70s, including the geopolitical side of things, which we haven't got into, were challenging the hegemony of business leadership in our economy and in our society. And I think it was deliberate and multidimensional in saying we want to roll that back all over. And you can, I think, see monetary policy, fiscal policy, social policy in terms of, trying to recreate this distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor, and the undeserving poor get a hard stick kind of approach to social policy. Certainly labor market, what they call labor market deregulation, but of course it isn't deregulation, it's labor market micromanagement with all 800 pages of the Fair Work Act. And the global dimension of it, the financialization would be another piece of it that we haven't talked about, and clearly financialization fits into the growth of high incomes for the top 1%. So I think it is, in a way, from their perspective, a coherent package. And from their goal, which was to reestablish business power and wealth, it's worked. Okay? Is it sustainable economically and politically? That's another question. But it's certainly achieved the goal of getting money to the top. It hasn't achieved the trickle-down flourishing of entrepreneurship and growth that they promised, but I don't think that was actually their goal.
Yeah, I mean, as well as financialisation and the attack on unions and attempt with the macro objective of getting wage under control, there's also, a serious ideological component of a free market critique of all forms of intervention, which, I think an important point to remember is, this wasn't a coup launched against a system that was flourishing. We had run into all sorts of difficulties with the breakdown of Bretton Woods, with a labour share that was probably too high, certainly for the system as it operated to sustain, and with sort of very ad hoc, with a regulatory state which was creaky in all sorts of ways. So it wasn't. First, it wasn't coming out of nothing. There was something real to react against, which explains why there was a significant base of popular support and/or acquiescence. What we've seen, I think, is not 100 on the market ideology part, not 100% failure, but clearly movements like privatisation have failed to convince the public that they're beneficial, and have and I think the room is there. And indeed, we're not only, in that sense, not only seeing the most left-wing Labor government in a long time, left-wing Labor opposition in a long time, but we're seeing a Conservative government saying, our solution to the energy crisis is we're going to expand a publicly owned power station, we're going to call corporations in and tell them they should behave better and charge lower prices, we're going to
control gas exports.
Control exports that the previous Labor government allowed to function on market arguments. We're going to give up on waiting for the private sector to build a railway from Melbourne to Brisbane and build it ourselves, and so forth. So I think that critique has lost most of its appeal. There were areas where it's successful, and but overall, the claims made for it are no longer credible. And the other thing is, speaking in the realm of ideas, there haven't been any good new ones for a long time. So in the 70s, there was really, in the 60s and 70s, a really serious intellectual critique coming out of places like Mont Pelerin that had powerful new arguments that sort of refuted the case for interventions that stood in important ways. That really hasn't happened for decades. They're living on fumes. Well, I'd say less so. I would say it's now. It's the back of the. It's people are now, I think, in a state of confusion that they sort of know what as with the decline of religion, they sort of know what they're supposed to think, but on the other hand, they're always coming up against stuff that does it. So you see, as I say, this contradiction in the behaviour of the government. On the one hand, they'll be saying that restricting negative gearing is going to take us back to Cuba, and the next thing saying, oh, by the way, we're going to commandeer gas supplies in order to give cheaper fuel to the people.
Yes.
Well put.
I'd just like to change direction a little bit with my question or comment. I see that why inequality is getting more of a focus is not necessarily because of the reduction in pay to workers and so on like that, but because the price of housing has gone up so much, and that it's going towards a new landlord class through the benefits of the taxation system that we have. And because you're seeing people now, they're giving up being able to own a house because they think that they'll never be able to own it. Possibly the only way they'll ever be able to own a house is if they inherit it off their parents. And that's a major cost in people's living, is if they've got to pay out rent all the time and they're not going to have an asset at the end, which you would have if you were paying a mortgage. So is it something that should be directed in regards to what kind of statistics would be available to show that? Because it certainly hasn't been showing in any statistics so far today.
Maybe I could comment a bit on that. I mean, first thing is that this is a very specifically Australian problem, because the housing booms that occurred elsewhere collapsed at the time of the global financial crisis. So it's something that's specific to Australia. I think it's important in the sense that we really have a two-level problem of inherited or transmitted wealth. The wealth at the very top, if you look at the list of billionaires, increasingly dominated, as I say, by mediocre second and third generation types rather than by the people who by hook or by crook built these fortunes. But then within the great mass of the population, you have the shift between essentially families where the parents can afford to put the kids on the housing ladder. Essentially, I think, certainly, I'll fess up. We realised this 20 years ago, that the only way our kids were going to be able to buy a house is if we came up with a deposit for it, and that's that I think has become increasingly the case, and that's quite a large slab of the population. Probably the top 2 quintiles of the population are now looking at this kind of transmission of housing wealth to their kids while still alive, as a route to get them into home ownership. And then you have still the majority of the population below that, where the parents don't have anything like the kind of resources that can finance a deposit, and where of course the kids have almost no chance of saving it. And the final point is that this is we're building up a crisis. I've for long on not believed in the crisis of the ageing of Australia, but what we are building up as a crisis in our retirement system, because that retirement system and pension system rests on the assumption that everybody except a small residual class will reach the age of 65 with an owner-occupied house and no mortgage. And what we're seeing, I think, is even among the class who do own a house, the expectation now is you pay off the interest, you never get round to paying off the principal, and people don't be retiring or reaching retirement age with very large debts that are difficult to handle.
Question down the back there. Sorry. Oh, sorry, you had a question there, did you? Oh, that's okay.
Thanks, guys. Very interesting talk. The relationship, John, that you've mentioned a number of times with politics and economics and the reality on the ground. I mean, your tremendous contribution to the Electrical Trades Union Not For Sale campaign didn't go unnoticed by most, but on the ground, these issues of housing and of cost of energy all come back to politics. And I ask you, and I was going to ask Sally before, in Queensland we've had almost 20 years of Labor, and why haven't Labor done the things that then they came and begged us to rejoin, to go back to what they meant? And they might be just showing some small signs, but the average person on the ground doesn't understand or take in any economic factors at all that we might be looking at here today. Have you got any suggestions about the focus that should take place to amend that?
Yeah, well, although there were some catastrophic failures under those Labor governments, most obviously the Bligh government's push for privatisation, which I remember actually Rachel Nolan had the hide to complain that the ETU was consistently attacking, having attacked her, they turned around and attacked the LNP who replaced her because both of them were supporting privatisation. But so that was, and what we've seen, I think, has been the Labor Party through most of this period has been saturated with this neoliberal ideology, with a better version of it. And I think, we should reflect that in important respects we have managed this neoliberal era better than most of the other English-speaking countries. The tax and transfer payments system has been more progressive than any other English-speaking countries, and the Queensland Labor governments have done a good job in some respects for example, moving towards higher quality health and education systems than we inherited from the Bill Peterson era. But they've also essentially gone along with this, with privatisation, with the idea of the national electricity market, with all of these general tendencies, and we're only now, I think, seeing the sway of that sort of stuff breaking. I mean, even a trivial dispute like by Queensland versus the free trade agreement says, you can no longer win an argument by saying, well, that's against the free market. We might lose the argument in court, but they're certainly not going to say, well, this is the free market and we have to go with it. So there's a bit of a shift.
If I might ask, the global crash that we attributed as being so fantastic worldwide, and I was working out in the building industry at the time, we would have gone absolutely broke if we didn't have the BER, was it, Building Education Revolution. The money that was spent on that kept the economy going and saved us from the same fate of the rest of the world. But all of the other economic criteria are just sort of nonsense. But Labor never stood up for themselves about that either.
No, that was a major failure. That Labor should have run hard on that instead essentially they capitulated.
Right, last question. Yeah, young.
It seems to me that the response to the current economic downturn is cheap money to the private sector. I'm just wondering whether that would, and it seems to me that increases inequality rather than decrease it. I'm just wondering what response you have to that.
Cheap money is certainly there and it's likely to stay. I suppose the question then is, well, who's going to borrow that money and spend it? And I suppose the argument increasingly we're seeing, I guess, in terms of infrastructure that governments are more willing to say, look, rather than pay 6% to a private sector firm for this, we'll borrow at 2% and build the thing ourselves. So I guess I see a potential positive there. But obviously, as I was saying before, there's this incredibly mixed picture where the same person will one day get up and say we're going to build this nation-building railway, and the private sector's only going to get a little tunnel at the end, and the next day say tightening up tax rules on trusts is the first step towards the gulag. I mean, it's sort of and that just reflects, I guess, the fact that we are in a very incoherent position.
There's another way in the monetary policy realm where John's point about neoliberalism's credibility crumbling is very evident, and that would be the breakdown of the consensus around inflation targeting being the one and only thing that central banks are supposed to do, and once they do it well, everything else will take care of itself. And that idea is in complete tatters. And now you've had, not in Australia, but in most of the world, the adoption of very unconventional and very non-neoliberal monetary policies that really, in a way, let the genie out of the bottle. Once you admit that, the central bank's going to have to create money out of thin air, in the same way private banks do every day, by the way, but we're going to let the central bank do it because we don't know what else to do to get the economy going. But then you can really ask questions, well, if we can do that, who's going to get the money and what are we going to do with it? And again, it's where I think there's an opportunity for a very powerful alternative vision of how to move forward.
Right, and on that note, hopefully, a little bit of moving forward occasionally. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Just before I introduce our next speaker, I would just like to say a thank you to one of our main sponsors for the event today, which is Q Super. So I just have a few words that I'd like to say in regards to Q Super. So they're proud to support the TJRyan Foundation today, our conference, in particular the presentation who we will see next by Professor Marion Baird. Q-Super was established over 100 years ago, and it's one of the oldest and largest financial institutions that we have here in Queensland. They are seeking to advance better outcomes for women, on average, who have lower retirement security than men, at a staggering 52% less in their retirement balances, meaning women will definitely experience higher rates of poverty and a greater reliance on the age pension. Remembering that many women take out time as carers to care for children or relatives. Women make up 71% of the part-time workforce, and I'm sure Marion will be able to correct me if any of these are incorrect. And they make up 2/3 of Q Super's membership. They also make up half of their employees. Q Super have sponsored our conference today because they are passionate about advocating for the positive change for the financial and social well-being of women. They are committed to improving the financial outcomes in retirement for all their members and acknowledge that there still is a lot of work to be done. So it's with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce one of Australia's leading researchers in the fields of women, work and family, Professor Marion Baird. She is the chair of the Discipline of Work and Organisational Studies in the University of Sydney's Business School and the Professor of Gender and Employment Relations. In addition to being recognised in the Australian Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence, she's received a number of federal and state government grants to research various topics in the fields of women, work and family. Professor Baird has been commissioned by business, non-for-profits, unions and other organisations to undertake workplace and policy-related research in regards to women and workforce engagement. She's widely published in Australia and internationally. Please help me welcome Professor Marion Baird.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for that long introduction. May I also thank Mary Crawford, where's Mary gone, for inviting me up, and particularly Q Super for sponsoring the conference and my visit. It's a real pleasure to be back in Brisbane. I did live here for a short while in the early 80s. I came up and worked for the Queensland Teachers Union for a short period of time, which I was saying to Jim as we flew in this morning, it was probably one of the most memorable times in my life because it was before I had children and I didn't have any family to support or worry about in Brisbane, so I had a really free rein and really enjoyed my time here and made some great friends. So I always return with enthusiasm, so thanks very much. I'm actually just back from an ASEAN meeting in Manila, the Philippines. And at that meeting, gender, equality and empowerment were the focus of attention. I have to say that wherever you go at the moment, there's a huge interest in women and in getting women back into the workforce. So in terms of my research area, I suppose I've been fairly fortunate to be interested in in this topic for some time. I've been researching women in work for close to 20 years now. And I've sort of lived and breathed the changes in the Australian labour market. And I want to really pick up on a couple of issues in today's presentation. I want to make an argument that we're not actually just arguing for equality, because that can run the risk of arguing for equality at a lower standard. We really need to make an argument for equality and quality, a quality society and equality for all. And I'll go through why I think that's really necessary in my presentation. I also want to sort of outline what I think would be the framework that we would need. What sort of policy framework do we need to reach this, what I hope would be a realistic state, but at the moment feels a bit idealistic. So I've called my speech the equality plus quality equation. And I mentioned that one of the things that all governments or people are really talking about at ASEAN and other places is getting more women back into the workforce. And the argument is put by almost every international think tank, every government around the world, that if we increase female workforce participation, the economic wisdom, if that's not an oxymoron, following my previous speakers, is that women's increased participation will increase GDP dramatically, and yes, it will, but will it increase the societies or improve the quality of life that we're living? The World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, and I have to read this out, says in 2016 is one of the most recent reports advocating increasing women's participation in the labour market. And they say that ensuring the healthy development and appropriate use of half of the world's talent pool, and I love that language, talent pool actually means people, and half of the world's talent pool is women. If we use half of the world's talent pool or increase its use, it will have a vast bearing on the growth, competitiveness and future readiness of economies and business worldwide. So I do agree with both Jim and John and Sally this morning about a turn in the sort of neoliberal argument. But I'm not convinced it's turned completely, because what we're now seeing is every argument about social good being couched in an economics or business case framing. And I think we have to be very careful then about how we use this language. I am greatly in favour of moving away from the neoliberal agenda, but I'm not convinced we've lost it completely. That Global Economic Forum go on to say, a variety of models and empirical studies have suggested that improving gender parity or equality may result in significant economic dividends. Notable recent estimates, and we hear these sorts of estimates all the time, suggest that economic gender parity could add an additional $240 billion to the GDP of the United Kingdom, $1,201 billion to that of the United States, $526 billion to Japan's GDP, $285 billion to the GDP of Germany. So we get these economic calculations constantly. In Australia, we've been told just last month by our Employment Minister, Michaelia Cash, that supporting women to participate in the workforce is an economic and social priority of the Turnbull government. It's good for business, it's good for women, and it's good for families, and it's good for our economy. So that is the rhetoric we're getting all the time. She goes on to say, boosting women's workforce participation is essential to raising living standards and securing Australia's future prosperity. It has the potential to add up to $25 billion to the Australian economy per year. So that's the economic argument. But I suppose we should be slightly pleased to hear that the World Economic Forum also put forward a more of a social case. They say there's a clear values-based case for promoting gender parity. Women are one half of the world's population, they've reminded us again, and evidently deserve equal access to health. I love the way they pop that word in. Evidently, they deserve equal access to health, education, economic participation and earning potential, and political decision-making. However, it's pertinent to note that gender parity is equally fundamental to whether and how societies thrive, ensuring the healthy development and appropriate use of half of the world's talent pool, again, has a vast bearing on the growth, competitiveness and future readiness of economies and businesses worldwide. So there you go. Everybody agrees, it seems, that men and women should be treated equally. It's good for the economy and good for society. The trouble is the reality doesn't match the rhetoric. Not in ASEAN, not in Europe, not in Australia, maybe in Scandinavia, and even there it's changed quite dramatically. So I just want to put up a list of some of the gaps in Australia at the moment, and I really don't expect you to go through those line by line. What's interesting to note when you compile these sorts of figures is that there is one area that women outperform, or where the gap is in favour of women, and that's in education. And that's been the case for probably the last 20 years. We've seen a huge swing to increasing the investment in education, in female education. Now, this is driven by females' personal desire to increase their qualifications, but also access to education and changing social norms and attitudes. The problem is, of course, that it hasn't paid off in the workforce, and I'll go on to consider that in more detail. So as I said at the beginning, I am interested in these inequalities, but I'm also interested in making a case for improving quality for all and not pursuing just an inequality agenda. Hence, the equality plus quality equation that I'd like to promote. And that equation goes something like this, that if we improve our gender equality policies at the workplace level and have an enabling institutional environment, we will have, or that will result in, improved gender equality outcomes and a higher quality society for all. So let's have a look at some of these rankings and quality indicators that we have around the world at the moment. And this really struck me over in Manila because people love to talk about gender gaps and gender gap reports and where countries sit. And I'm always worried about those indexes anyway, but having this conference in mind made me really think about what lies behind those indices. So the one that's most often reported is the Global Gender Gap Report. And on that report, Australia ranks 46th in the world. The top countries, the top 5 countries, perhaps you can guess, you'll guess the first 4 anyway, Iceland, Finland, Norway and Sweden, and then Rwanda is 5th. So there you go. That makes me think, okay, there's something going on in the way they do these calculations. Also ahead of Australia are the Philippines at 7, Nicaragua at 10 and South Africa at 15. So how do they do these rankings? Well, they use 4 different areas: economic participation and opportunity, where Australia ranks first. Economic participation opportunity, where we rank 42nd. Educational attainment, where Australia ranks first in the world. Political empowerment, where Australia ranks 61st, and health and survival, where Australia ranks 72nd. So you can see our ranking is really sort of varied or dispersed. But I think when you look deeper into those rankings, you get the picture of what I'm trying to say here. The reason why countries like the Philippines, Rwanda, Nicaragua and South Africa rank higher is because both men are equally doing poorly on those ratings. But the ratings then make them look like they're doing well. And I think that is the issue we really need to consider. What do we want when we think about equality, and what do we want when we think about the sort of society we want to live in? We know that women are now and have been for some time outdoing men in terms of educational qualifications. As I've said, there's a 10 to 11% gap in favour of women. But does this translate to the workplace? No. And so that's where I want to go now, to the labour market and to 2 gaps that often get discussed. So the first one is the participation gap, the one that the government wants us to increase, and the second one is the pay gap, and then I want to talk about the implications for superannuation. I might come back to this because I'm worried I'm going to run out of time, but this is really my argument for building a society that has a framework that suits all: the workplace policies, the enabling institutional environment, women's empowerment, and a better outcome for all. So I'll leave about 5 pages and we can come back to that sort of section if we like. Because really where I want to go next then is other labour market statistics. So if we look at these statistics here, you can see that women have been pulling their weight over the last few years, 30 to 40 years, and increasing their participation in the Australian labour market. But the other thing we see is that men have actually been declining their participation rate. So that raises a concern. We have slightly declining by about 10% over that period, male participation, and constant, although perhaps levelling out now, female participation. So that's participation, and I know that some of my colleagues in the room will say shouldn't just look at participation, because participation includes everyone who's willing to work. So it includes those who are in work and those who are looking for work. So let's look at employment rates, that is, men and women who actually have jobs. And here we can see quite an interesting pattern as well. The gap between males and females is closing. And again, males' employment rates have been falling and females' employment rates have been increasing. So that, for me, in terms of equality, is not actually what we want to see. It's not such a good idea to improve equality between the genders by decreasing the standards of one, which is what you can do. And the current government's plan is to close the gap in participation rates by 25% by 2025. Well, you can do that in 2 ways. You can increase female participation, or male participation can decrease. So, you know, numbers are, well, you have to be careful how we use them, as we all know. Here's the labour force participation rate by age. And here you see another interesting pattern occurring. Men and women, when they're younger, both participate in reasonably high proportions. Females actually participate more than men in the 15 to 19-year-old age group. Then it starts to drop away a bit. And you can see that overall, except for that youngest age group, men's participation rates are slightly higher, and higher in some age groups considerably than women's. And the reason for that, of course, is because women are bearing children and leaving the labour market. This is men's participation rates over their lifetime. It's that other graph drawn differently, but also comparing different years, the 70s to now. And it's a bit hard to see the differences, except that what you can see in that graph is that men's life cycle participation, the picture of it or the curve of it, hasn't changed dramatically in the last 30 to 40 years. Men enter the workforce, they stay in the workforce, and then they leave around 60 to 65. They did extend their workforce participation in the 80s as a response to the GFC and the need to build up their super funds. But this is women's participation rates, and this is where we do see the quite dramatic, or employment rates I'm measuring here really. We do see quite a difference between men and women. And the big shift that's happened here, well, there are 2 major shifts. Here you can see the differences more clearly. The blue line is women in the 1970s, and you can see women entered the labour market, came out of the labour market to have children, stayed out for a while, and then some went back, but not in the same proportions as before, and then left the labour market. So that's the classic M curve, and that dip, or that nappy valley, is the time when they're having children and caring for their babies. But if you look at the other line, the top line that sort of has a straighter line at the top there, maybe I've got a pointer here actually. Oh, it doesn't work. Okay, well, people can see that. I mean, that shows there's been a huge change in Australia, that Australian women with children enter the labour market and they stay attached to the labour market through their childbearing years. In some states, they actually increase their participation rates when they have children. In New South Wales, that's the case. And I think that's because, back to the housing issue, because of mortgage stress and education. So cost of education and houses increases their participation rates. That's one hypothesis anyway. The other big shift that we haven't talked about much in Australia yet is the other peak happening, and that's mature age women. Women 45 to 50 and above, they have actually increased their participation rates more than any other group in Australia. in the last 20 years. So we have two enormous shifts in the characteristic of the Australian labour market, and that is female participation, females of childbearing age, and then women of a more mature age. And the government wants more of those women to return. But what are women doing in Australia? This is their response to our framework, and that is they work part-time. This is a graph of full-time employment by age groups, but you'll see for all age groups it hasn't shifted that much. And in fact, if we aggregated the lot, full-time employment for women has actually decreased slightly over that period of time. So in Australia we have a 1.5 breadwinner or a 1+ breadwinner model, and Australian women, although they've increased their participation altogether, have actually decreased their hours of work. And I have to rush through. So what happens as a result of that? Well, we know that there's a pay gap. The pay gap most recently reported in Australia is 15.3%. That's a slight decline from last year, about 0.9%. So we've closed the pay gap. We've improved our inequality. But how have we done that? And that returns to our previous speaker's comments. We've closed the pay gap really because men's pay didn't grow as rapidly and because overall wage growth was low. So men's pay increased by 1.5% and women's pay by 2.6%. Now that's relatively a better outcome for women, but it's not a better outcome for the whole group, and it's not really the way we would want to close a pay gap. It would be better, I think, if we could argue for higher wages for everyone, as Sally was saying this morning. Just for your interest, the highest or worst gaps are in the financial insurance sectors, professional, scientific and technical services, and rental, hiring and real estate. The best outcomes are in public administration, other services and retail trade. So the gap is closest in two industries that are characterised by slightly different wage setting mechanisms. One where it's more centralised, and that's the public sector, and two in retail where it's dominated by women, so that the industry gap is smaller because there are more women in that industry. So we've got a pay gap occurring, and that partly explains it's partly explained by the hours of work women do, but not totally. And most research will show that the major reason for a pay gap is outright discrimination, and second reasons are segregation and the valuing of jobs that women do. So we've got these shifts in the labour market. We've got this huge issue about a pay gap that is persistent. And the other thing we've got in Australia, which is affecting women, is that we're an ageing society. So more and more women in Australia are living longer. That's another area where men could do better. And I hope that they do better rather than women do worse. So we do have a gap in age. Women live longer than men, and you can see by 2025 there's going to be many more women than men. And also that dependency ratio for the economy is quite stark, that the number of people who depend on younger people for services and financial help through our tax system is going to increase. So we have a real need to think about our super industry because, of course, that's the issue. That's how we're supposed to fund our retirement. And there we have a really complex problem because the combination of women's working lives and their experience in the workforce, coupled with the pay gap, has led to a huge superannuation gap. And I can't see that closing very quickly at all. Of the Australian population over 65, 14.5% are more. There are 14.5% more women than men, and by the time we get to 85 and above, there are 3 times as many women than men. Those women, given their work histories, are much more likely to be dependent on assistance from outside the household finances, and more dependent on finances from the state. So what is that system? Well, it's a combination of our aged pension system and our superannuation system. Many of those older women will not have access to any superannuation. That may change, and I'd be interested to hear from if we could get good data on younger men and women in the workforce and how that will, sort of the cohort effect might change ageing and retirement later. But we do know, and this has already been referred to, there is a massive inequality in our superannuation system. Now, there's different sets of data, and I know one set was quoted before. So here I'm drawing on data from a colleague, Siobhan Austin at Curtin University, the Women in Super pay report, and the Senate report on the super system. So you can see that there's, for the male median super balance is in favour of men by 28%. But if we go into the age group who are 45 to 50, that balance is that gap is even wider. And so women who are of that older age have much less funding through their superannuation than younger, but furthermore, than men. But furthermore, what's really interesting to see and worrying is that the flow of money into super funds is highly gendered. So here we can see that employers' money going into super funds of men and women clearly favours men at the moment, and that goes back to our gender gap problem, pay gap problem, and our working hours problem. It also goes back to motherhood, and as with pay, if you're a woman with children, your pay is the lowest. If you're a woman with children, your superannuation is the lowest. If you're a man with children, your pay is the highest. If you're a man with children, your superannuation is the highest. So we have a really complicated set of problems here that we would want to address if we were to close that superannuation gap. We have a gender pay gap, which is informed by discrimination and segregation. We've got a motherhood working hours gap, which is a result of our gender order, inflexibility, I haven't even touched on that, and our broken childcare system. We have a motherhood pay gap because of the working hours that mothers work and the value of work that many women do once they have children, often shift where they work and the rewards they're getting. And because of our system of supplementary contributions, women do not have the funds to put into the supplementary contributions, so that gap is also widening. They don't have the capacity to contribute because their combined pay and income doesn't give them any excess in order to put into their superannuation. So trying to come to the end here, where do I think we should go to from here? Well, as I said, I think we need to raise the bar on all areas. We should be aiming for quality plus equality. We need a much better work regime, and that goes to the comments that Sally was making this morning. We do need to change the rules. We need a much better care regime, because it's only if we improve our childcare and our elder care. Remember, I said the other big group who have entered the labour market are women who are older, who also have elder care responsibilities. Unless we change that care regime, the government's goal to increase labour force participation cannot be reached. We do need to increase our pay, not just for women, but for women and men, but we also need to close the gap between men's and women's pay, so we need pay equality. But I also think we need to reinvent the superannuation structure that we have in Australia. It was and is held up to be one of Australia's great inventions, terrific in the 80s for a largely male workforce and modelled on a male's full-time working life, but doesn't fit the working life of women in Australia today. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marion. A lot to think about there, and right, so I'm sure there'll be loads of questions. Questions? Everyone's too stunned. Here we are, yes, the young woman over there, Mary.
I was just curious about reinventing the superannuation structure and your thoughts on where that should sit, whether it's as an employer from a government perspective or a combination of both.
Yeah, well, definitely from a combination of both. I mean, there's some clear changes we should make very soon. The obvious one, and it has been argued for some time, is to add superannuation to the paid parental leave so that at least for that period of time women aren't breaking their superannuation contributions. Because of the nature of superannuation, of course, the cumulative effect, if you lose out for a period of time, it does have an effect on your overall retirement. The low income threshold should be changed as well, the $450 a month, of course, to both enable women and casual workers to get a contribution. Plus, of course, there's a lot of attention to various aspects, but increasing the superannuation levy, the government, the employer levy. I mean, most people seem in agreement with that, but getting it done. There are lots of actual recommendations. I have to admit, it's not I'm not an expert in superannuation, but reading the various reports from the Henry Committee there are lots of great recommendations in those reports about what could be done to start to improve the system. But the problem is it's much deeper than just the structure of the superannuation system. It's also about the structure of pay. So in other countries, what they're doing now is putting money into female super schemes when they're on any caring break from the workforce. So Chile's they put an amount of public money into each woman's superannuation scheme in order to just keep the baseline higher through the rest of their working life as well. So I think that there are probably lots of plenty of structural issues we should look at, but there's some key ones we could do straight away, which would start to close the gap. It wouldn't really solve the whole problem, though.
Yes, another woman here, ma'am. No, we need you to the microphone.
Hello, thank you. Just with the divorce rate,
yes.
There was no kind of commentary there about the impact of divorce and super splitting and so on.
Absolutely, yes, sorry. I mean, there are so many bits that I didn't get to cover, but you're right. There's some very... the current scheme, and this is my colleague Siobhan Austin's sort of area, but she's written about this, the structure of the current scheme assumes that what will happen is that men will stay married to women and that when they reach retirement, they will share equally their superannuation with women. And the reality is that that's not happening, both through broken marriages but all sorts of other issues. So that's another issue that I think we need to address.
Right, yes, Tim.
Thank you. It's a well-known fact that GDP and environmental degradation are positively correlated. In the United States, in the last 30-odd years, GDP's risen quite significantly, but the genuine progress indicator, the GPI, has actually fallen, very much because of environmental issues, but also issues relating to congestion and smaller housing lots, all those sorts of things. So I was surprised that your emphasis on raising GDP through increased participation rates, and you were apologetic that men had a declining participation rate in the last 40 years.
Yeah, don't misinterpret what I was saying. I am sceptical of that argument too. That's what I was saying, that all the governments around the world and international bodies are advocating it, but I don't think it is the right way to go unless we examine the quality of life that we're also experiencing.
All right. So just in conclusion, I'd say I think the best thing to bring about equality would be to lower men's participation rates and lower the growth in GDP over time rather than try and bring women up to men. That's where the quality would happen.
Yes.
I know the men wouldn't do any work at home, but that's...
Well, actually...
They can be trained.
No, that's true. So, look, I think... In principle, I sort of agree with what you're saying. The problem is that the decrease in men's participation rates isn't usually through choice of the men, it's through structural shifts in the economy. If it was a positive move that they were saying, I want to work fewer hours in order to look after children or contribute to society, that would be a nice outcome. But that's not the way it's working. We could look at the Dutch model where there is a sort of an argument that they have almost the better system now, better than Sweden, and men and women in professional relationships tend to work 4 days a week each rather than 5. Yes, so as with all these things, trying to sort of argue all the detail is hard in 20 minutes, but I'm not disagreeing with you. If we could decrease men's, probably not participation, but hours of work. And I think that's where we should be looking. It's the distribution of hours of work, both within gender and across or between genders, because that's a real problem.
Yes, Linda here. I think you can probably hear. No, we need you for the recording.
I'm on the mark. You're on faster, Mary. Okay. Hi, thanks very much, Marion, and I realised that there was a lot you couldn't say.
That's right.
2 questions, I guess, about superannuation.
Yeah.
One is we understand there's a very large amount of unpaid employer contributions to superannuation, and they are particularly focused amongst casual and, the casual workforce,
yes.
Which presumably ways of ensuring that was paid would certainly help women. And the second one, and it's probably a little bit more complicated than you can handle right now, but the huge growth in superannuation has been in self-managed superannuation funds. And I'm wondering what research there has been on women versus men's control over self-managed superannuation funds.
I can only partially answer both questions, but the first one, the super theft, is a real problem, and it's not just for women. I think a lot of youth are caught in that as well, and that's part of the structure of opting for the schemes that you're contributing to, and I think it would be better if we could roll them all into one and make it as it used to be. It just goes. You don't get much choice about where it goes, and it goes into that. And we do need to work out a way of reclaiming that money. The second one, the issue of what was it? Self-managed. We've done a little bit of research that goes to that question. You may have sort of realised that sort of an accompanying argument to all this argument about there should be more women in the workforce is the argument that women are opting out of the workforce, and there's the growth in what are called mumpreneurs, female entrepreneurs, and they're opting out because the workplaces they used to work in are so inflexible and difficult for them to mix their care and work. So we've done a study of those women, and what we found with those women who are setting up their own businesses, there are 2 things they're not doing. They're hardly paying themselves a wage at all, and none of them are paying any superannuation into their own funds. They're not even aware of it a lot of the time. So I think that really is a major concern. But I haven't seen, and maybe the super people here have got more data on the split in self-managed funds between male and female. It would be really worth knowing that. I'll follow that up. Thank you.
And last but not least, our American visitor.
How do you do?
Hi, Marion.
Hi.
I was really curious about the quality aspect of your equation.
Yeah.
And just how to evaluate, or if there were metrics in place for evaluating the quality of work. If, say, a mother is only able to work 6 hours as compared to everyone else's 9 or 10, how she could approach her employer, or if there were already, like I said, metrics in place to kind of determine what her quality of work is.
There are lots of metrics around workplaces and what their policies are like, and how whether or not they're working for women or for any parents or people with other responsibilities. Just trying to think, I'm not aware of one. It's sort of an interesting idea of one that would say, how do we measure an individual woman's work experience compared to another person's? I mean, hours of work, we do know if you reduce your hours of work, it immediately leads to a wage drop. But it doesn't necessarily lead, or it hasn't to date, and I think this will change too, to an hourly wage drop, because in Australia we have had, until now, quite a good system, which I think we probably haven't realised how important it is, that part-time workers, I'm not talking about casual part-time workers, get pro rata the conditions, pay and conditions of full-time workers in most cases. In countries like Canada and America, Jim, you might correct me on Canada, they don't. They get lower. Like being part-time actually gives you lower hourly wages as well as other access to other conditions of work. So it's a really important aspect of our system that we have to hold on to. Of course, it's being eroded because casualisation is the way to get around that. Our casual loadings protect our hourly rates a bit until we knock them off as well. But of course, casuals don't have access to the paid leaves, etc., of a permanent part-time or full-time worker. So you could develop a sort of a metric, casual, part-time, full-time, and we could think about how that could best be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Marion, it's been fantastic. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
We all look forward to your coming. And I want to say a special thank you to Marion for coming, because she was away overseas earlier in the week. So it's with great joy you've come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure, Mary. Thank you.